Okay, tiny people, you're going to receive these at home. You're going to get a ballot electronically, which lists on top the people running for president, on the bottom the people running for vice president. You may vote for nobody. You may vote for one person. You may vote for one person for president, one person for vice president. Now, I must know what your section is. So if you just send it back to me in an email and it doesn't say your section, your vote does not count. I won't look it up for you. You have to make sure that you get your section on there. Send them back to me as quickly as you can after you get them, and I'll send them over to Mr. Goddard. Mr. Goddard does the politics, so he will be the guy who's going to be adding these all up. It's like states when people run for president. They take the state, not the number of individual votes. Okay, shut that down for a minute. All right, here we go. Get the notebooks out. We're raring to go. We were talking about the Peninsular Campaign. So let's just run through it a little bit. We talked about George McClellan being in command of this huge Union army, the Army of the Potomac. And it's important to remember the name of the commander and the name of the army here. And he was a great training general. He turned them into a first-rate army. The men loved him, but he was not a good field commander. Yeah, buddy.
Is it Potomac or Potomac?
Potomac. P-O-T-O-M-A-C. Capital P-O-T-O-M-A-C. All right. And remember his plan. His plan was a pretty good plan. Rather than marching through hostile territory all the way through northern Virginia where there would be snipers and ambushes and traps and such set where he might lose thousands of men, instead, he wanted to put the army onto boats, get them down to the Yorktown Peninsula, and then march a far shorter distance over to Richmond. He'd have fewer people to deal with and fewer problems. It was a good plan. He just wasn't a good commander. We talked about one of the big things that fed into his being a bad commander was this fella, Alan Pinkerton, who was his intelligence officer. Now, the job of an intelligence officer is to gather information about the enemy's side. Do you ever have one of those days where, like, all of a sudden your cloth mask refuses to let any air whatsoever through?
Yes. Yes. Except it's not cloth.
Man. Okay, let's try this. Okay, now you're all steamy. All right. Well, Alan Pinkerton, he was a great private detective. He could find out, if your business partner was cheating, but not good at guessing enemy strength. He always guessed that the Confederates had about twice as many as they actually did. In actual fact, the Army of the Potomac had 121,500 people. That's the Northern Army. The Southern Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, had about 60,000 people. So the Union, the North, outnumbered the Confederates about 2-to-1 to begin with. But they used tricks to deceive the Union, like we talked about one, John Magruder, the Confederate general who marched his men up and down over the hill while the Union could see them and just kept marching the same men over the hill. And Alan Pinkerton kept counting them and thinking there were that many people. All right, the Confederate commander at the beginning was Joe Johnston. And Joe Johnston was a very capable commander, and he would be back to command again in the West. But at the start, Joe Johnston had the big army in Northern Virginia. He began this campaign he began to fight off the Peninsular Campaign that McClellan was waging. But at a battle, he was shot up pretty badly. He was shot, got some shrapnel in him. He was out, he's gone. And the person that was there to take command, now did we talk about Lee taking command? Yeah. Okay, it was Robert E. Lee, and he would become the most famous of the Confederate generals. What is a campaign? Now, we talked about this earlier in the year. A campaign is a series of battles with one goal, like a political campaign where the politicians go through running for president and they're trying to win each state. I got to win Maryland. I got to win Alabama. I've got to win Florida. I got to win Texas. Those are all different battles, but the one goal is to become president of the United States, to get their nomination from the party and then to win the presidency. Well, we had a couple of different campaigns going on here. The Union campaign was the Peninsular campaign. That was to fight up the length of Yorktown Peninsula to capture Richmond. They fought several battles along the way. I mean, time and again, the Confederates tried to stop them, but the Union kept moving north very, very slowly because McClellan was so hesitant. But it was a number of battles with one goal. The one goal was to capture Richmond. Robert E. Lee was a genius at war. Now, the reason he was a genius at war, or what gave him this huge advantage, was because he had been in the Army so long. He had commanded, he had appraised, he had known all of the Union commanders that he would face. He knew McClellan, and he knew McClellan's weakness was that McClellan always thought he needed more. McClellan always thought he was probably outnumbered and that things just weren't going well for him. So Robert E. Lee said, okay, I know how to defeat this guy. And the way to defeat this guy is I am going to attack him 7 days in a row. So they're going to have 7 battles. This is the 7 days campaign, 7 battles. And the goal is to get McClellan to retreat. So he's going to attack his army because usually the army that attacks is the bigger army. The guys that have fewer, the army that has fewer people, that they usually run and find some place to hide and build up defenses. And he turns Stonewall Jackson loose in the Shenandoah Valley. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but Stonewall Jackson's Shenandoah Valley campaign was amazing. Stonewall Jackson became the most feared of the Confederate generals. And as a matter of fact, it was that Northern mothers would threaten their kids, you know, if you don't go to bed right now, Stonewall will get you. I mean, he was legendarily scary. I told you before, he was a religious fanatic, so he was absolutely fearless because if God wanted him to die that day, that was okay with him. And if God wanted him to live, that was okay with him too. And if God wanted his left arm blown off, that was okay with him too. It didn't matter. So he had no fear because whatever God wanted, that's what was going to happen anyway. Anyway, Stonewall Jackson drove his men unbelievably, but they were incredibly successful. And Stonewall Jackson was a weird guy. Oh, Stonewall Jackson was a weird guy. He would, he was known, he'd been in the Army for a while, and he was known to be a good general, but he was, for a while, he got out of the Army and he taught at Virginia Military Institute, and he was known to be the most boring teacher that ever was. I mean, just the most incredibly boring, because what he would do is, he was afraid that he didn't know quite as much as the students or that they would ask him difficult questions. So he would sit down on a stool in his room and he would memorize what he was going to say the next day. I mean, word for word, phrase for phrase, syllable for syllable, he would memorize exactly what he was going to say. Then he would go back and he would think in his mind, okay, in this class, I have Omar. And Omar at this point is likely to ask me this question. Then he would think of what the answer to that question was, and he would memorize that. Then he would say, and a little later, Annalise might ask me this. And he would think of the question, he would make up an answer, then he would memorize the answer, which made him a horribly boring teacher because he never said anything that wasn't exactly memorized, couldn't ad-lib anything. But it made him an incredible general because he would make his plan and then he would go through it in his head and say, okay, what would happen if I lost this cannon? What would happen if these soldiers got killed? What would happen if this commander was shot? And he would have figured out the solution. So in battle, if somebody came up and said, General, the third cannon's been blown out and Colonel Hoskins has been killed, he'd say, move Lieutenant Parker over to take the second cannon from 3rd Battery over there, have Captain Jones take over. And just instantly, because he had already worked out the problem in his head. So he became an incredible commander. And in the Shenandoah Valley campaign, it lasted 39 days. He marched his men 699 miles in those 39 days. You might say, man, that's a lot of walking. Except they also fought 5 pitched battles. That is, they stopped and fought day-long battles. And he was extremely religious. He wouldn't go on Sundays. So take the 39 days, subtract the Sundays, subtract the 5 days for battles, and then figure out marching nearly 700 miles in the rest of the days. They called themselves foot cavalry because they went as far in a day on foot as most units of cavalry, guys on horseback, went. All right? His goal was to keep Irwin McDowell, that guy who had commanded the first Bull Run. He had some more troops, Union troops up in Washington. And what Jackson's purpose was to keep him from bringing his soldiers down to reinforce McClellan, because Lee was barely hanging on. He couldn't possibly beat 75,000 more troops coming down. And he moved them around. Well, we'll talk more about this later. Just understand it was a phenomenal little bit of business here. Ooh. Oh, wait, ho! Okay. McClellan fought up the peninsula, and he actually got to within 8 miles of Richmond. He was that close. But he finally gave in to his fears and decided if Lee keeps attacking me, he's got to have more men than I do. And he pulled back. And he pulled way back. He pulled all the way back to the tip of the peninsula and sent this message to Abraham Lincoln. I shall attempt to save the army. He has more than twice as many soldiers as the other guys. He says, I shall attempt to save the army, send more gunboats, get me out of here. Get me some firepower to keep me safe down here on the tip of the peninsula. Okay. When I biked cross country, one of the places that I actually stayed was on the battlefield at Malvern Hill. There was a little church there, and I was able to camp in their basement. Just stay in there. Lots of churches open themselves up to bikers. And this is a picture that was discovered not too terribly many years ago. It's Private Edward Jennison. He's a Confederate private from Georgia. And the reason this is such a haunting picture, he was killed at Malvern Hill. And if you take a look at him, you could see that's a young kid. That's a young kid. And he was a Georgia private. I mean, he was a private in the Civil War, not a drummer boy, not somebody running messages around. He was a soldier. And this is such a haunting picture because the South lost a whole generation of men. The North lost more men, but they had such a bigger population that it didn't affect them in quite the same way. The South really lost a whole generation of men fighting the Civil War. And I take a look at this, and now my youngest son was in the Army, and 2 times I got to hug him and kiss him and say, good luck as he went off to war, because he went to Afghanistan 2 times. And just thinking about the way things were back then, dads didn't get to hug their kids. You can give them a firm handshake maybe or something. And just that little fresh-faced boy heading off to war, and then he never came back. He was killed at the battle. It's a kind of a devastating thing when you think about it. Plus, in the American Civil War, both sides were American casualties. That's why it adds up to being such a horrendous event in American history. I mean, there have been about 1.5 million casualties, and the best guesstimate is about 1 million of them were in the Civil War, 4 years. Okay. Yeah. Okay, why don't we get the exit thing? Talk to me, people.
Any questions?
The 3 dots.
Okay. But I'm prepared for this. Not that technology never works.
That's the end.
No.
Oh, the sunglasses are cool.
Okay. Let's talk about the monitor versus the Merrimack. Incidentally, the notes are going to be up very shortly. I won't have a chance to get them up there until second period, but you can take these as we go along. The monitor versus the Merrimack is one of the most important naval battles in history, and it never happened. You will hear college professors talking about monitor versus Merrimack, and that just didn't happen. Okay, let's take a peek. This was the age of sail. This was these big wooden ships that had incredible firepower. I mean, there were 160 gun ships out there. That meant they had 80 cannons shooting off of each side of the ship, massive things. And the problem was they were made out of wood. Then ships have developed a little bit. This is the USS Gerald R. Ford, the biggest ship we've ever built, an aircraft carrier. Look at that. This is 606,271,221 tons. Okay, so multiply this by 2,000. That's how much this thing weighs. I mean, it's incredible how big ships are. Have you guys ever seen one of those pictures of like the Mayflower alongside an aircraft carrier?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's hilarious. If the side wall were the aircraft carrier, you know, the Mayflower is like this. So yeah, ships are a bit bigger now. Yes, sir. What are the things on the side?
Tugboats.
What are we talking about, these?
Yeah.
Yeah, tugboats. Pulling them in and maneuvering them inside to get them up to the dock. Okay, cool. Incidentally, when I lived in Charleston, went to the Citadel, there's this huge bridge. It's ripped down now, replaced by a different one, but there was this huge, high arcing bridge. The naval base is up the Cooper River. I think this one goes over the Cooper River. Two coolest things ever happened to me. And well, three coolest things ever happened to me in Charleston. The first one was going over that bridge above an aircraft carrier. That was really cool to be up above an aircraft carrier driving a little car. Second one was I was up on the bridge and a nuclear sub popped up right underneath me. That was very cool. Third one was I was just walking on the battery, a school of porpoises came by and started dancing around right in front of me. Okay. The world changed in a day. Now you had these incredible wooden navies. Remember, Britain was indisputably the most powerful navy in the world. They were incredible. They were on an island and they had decided we must build up our navy. The only way to keep our island safe is to make sure that other people can't get to it. Well, there have been other times when things changed the world instantly. Drop the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. All of a sudden, it's the age of nuclear weapons. I mean, that's still such a big thing. What's the big deal going on even today? Who are they worried about getting a nuclear weapon? Iran. They're busy, the US is busy trying to negotiate their way out of Iran getting nuclear weapons. Okay, let's see here. Stock market crashes and all of a sudden you went from the roaring 20s, this great big boom time to people standing in soup kitchen lines, trying to get enough to feed themselves. Stay alive till tomorrow. Know who that is? Jonas Salk, polio vaccine. Polio was this horrible crippling disease. And I mean, it took out children left, right, and sideways. There were so many kids, you know, the iron lungs they'd have to be in trying to breathe for them. And even, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of World War II, he was completely crippled. He was in a wheelchair. He wouldn't let pictures of himself be taken like that because he didn't want to appear weak. But if he ever stood at a rally or something, he would be behind a closed curtain and they would wheel him in, and then he would get up and lean on the lectern, and then they would open the curtain, and then he could speak for just a few minutes because he was holding himself up by his arms. And then they'd close the curtain and they'd bring his wheelchair back in because he couldn't stand because of polio when he was a child. He was a president. He came from a very rich family. And Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine, just took polio out of the equation. Incidentally, one of the greatest human beings as far as philanthropy ever. Somebody said, so, what are you going to do with the patent for this? And he said, I didn't take out a patent for this. Well, who owns the rights to it? And he said, I don't know, I guess the people. He just gave it away so that polio would be wiped out. I mean, he could have made millions and millions and millions. Somebody have a hand up? Okay. All right. Well, here comes an ironclad. Yeah, buddy.
Wait, how'd the world change?
How the world changed in a day? You could count on, everybody knew somebody that was crippled from polio. Do you know anybody crippled from polio?
No, not the polio. It's just,
We're about to tell you. This is an ironclad, okay? Pitch pine, hard pine and oak, 4-inch iron sheathing on the outside, 4 inches thick. And pretty much guns in the Navy, guns out at sea aren't as big as land guns can be. There was not a single Navy gun that could harm this ship. I mean, they might loosen a piece of the iron so it had to go back and be repaired a little bit, but they can't sink it. It's just sheathed in iron. This is not the Merrimack, which is what most people say, the Monitor versus the Merrimack. This is the CSS Virginia. Remember what CSS stands for, or USS?
Confederate States Ship.
Confederate States Ship. So this is a Confederate ship that is the first one that came out and fought. Now, because it couldn't be damaged by other naval ships, the world changed in a day. It was March 8th, 1862. The Merrimack came out of Norfolk Harbor in Virginia. What had happened was the USS Merrimack, the USS Merrimack had gone in for repairs before the war broke out, before Virginia seceded. And what they did was, this was a naval base where they fixed ships. They took the top off it. They had the hull, and they took the masts off it, and the top and the hull were still there, but no masts, so it couldn't be sailed. It was a sailing ship. And when Virginia seceded, the sailors who were loyal to the Union said, well, we don't want to give these guys a warship. All we have to do is put new masts on, so let's get rid of it. And then they took it out into the harbor, and they set it on fire, and they sank it. Anybody see a problem with their plan?
Yeah.
What's that?
You can't make things burn underwater.
Yeah, you can't have things burn underwater. So if you want to set it on fire, set it on fire. You know, sink it. But if you set it on fire to destroy it, then you sink it, it puts the fire out, which is what happened. It did burn off the top part of the ship, but the hull, which is the hardest part to make, was still fine. So the Confederates got out and raised up the hull, knocked off the burnt part, and rebuilt the Virginia and made it with the iron sheathing. And on March 8th, 1862, it came out and did this. It sailed up to the USS Cumberland, which was an American Navy ship, a warship, experienced captain. And the captain saw this thing coming. He says, all right, boys, we don't want that too near to us. It's flying a Confederate flag. Fire on it. So they fired on it, and the cannonballs just bounced off. And they kept firing on it, and then the Virginia sailed right on over, turned sideways, get the cannons pointed at it, and destroyed the Cumberland, sank it. And then it sailed over to the next ship in the blockade, the USS Congress. And the USS Congress, another experienced captain, experienced crew, they turned around and they fired on the Virginia, and the cannonballs bounced off. And the Virginia sailed right on up and sank the Congress. Then it went over, chased down another ship, the USS Minnesota. But the USS Minnesota's captain, again experienced, said, look, the Cumberland and the Congress both fired everything they had at this thing and it just bounced off. I got to get out of here to save my ship. So he started to run as fast as he could, and the Virginia managed to maneuver it so that he ran up onto a sandbar. He beached himself. And then they thought, okay, he's not going anywhere. It's been a long day. We already sank a couple of ships, so let's go out and we'll come back tomorrow and sink it. Now think about this. These were the European fleets. I mean, it's expensive to build a ship. Britain had 113 ships of war. I mean, big ships of war. France 45, Spain 45, Russia 34, Denmark 21. Those were the big European fleets. And on that day, March 8th, 1862, it was proven that any country that could build one ironclad could defeat the British Navy. So they went from being the supreme power on the seas to being a country that really desperately needed to start building some iron ships. Okay, this is in the notes, guys. But you all look so happy doing that. How's it going, Sean? How we doing? How was your weekend? Did you eat a lot of food? No? No big Easter meal? No? Did you hunt eggs? No? Eat chocolates? Okay, all right. Hello?
Hi, I just was checking to see if Abdul came.
Nope.
Nope, okay, got it.
Marian Abdul.
Okey-dokey.
Okay, cool. Well, the next day, March 9th, the Virginia sailed out of harbor to go destroy the Minnesota. Only when they came out, there was this ship, a Union ironclad. Now, they built theirs in a very different way. The Confederate ship, the Virginia, looked kind of like a standard ship. It had cannons pointed out at the side. The Monitor was a bit smaller and it had a turret. That is, the gun could spin around not a whole 180 degrees, but most of the way, which gave it an advantage in that it could keep firing, didn't have to line up sideways to its target. But it was also an ironclad. So they spent the day shooting at each other, and neither one could do real damage because they just had naval guns on there. So they fought to a draw. And then the Virginia went back into Norfolk Harbor, and the Monitor stayed to make sure that it didn't come out again. So it pretty much they sat out the rest of the war. At the end of the war, the Confederates themselves sank the Virginia because as the northern part of Virginia was being overrun, they didn't want the Union to get a hold of the ship. There were other ironclads and other ironclad battles, but that was the big and the first. Just so you know, there were other first things here. This actually was in the American Revolution. It's called the Turtle. It was a submarine. Did you guys know there was a submarine in the American Revolution?
Mhm.
It didn't work. It was like a bicycle, that the guy had to move along underwater. And so he'd move around and he had to get right next to a wooden ship. Then he would turn this crank. It's got a drill bit on the front. And he'd try to drill a hole in the bottom of the wooden ship and then run it back out again and then go away while water poured into the wooden ship and it would sink. That was the thought anyway. It really didn't work. However, during the Civil War, the Confederates came up with a CSS Hunley, which was the first submarine to successfully sink another ship. That is the Hunley. It took them a long, long time to find the thing. The person who invented it, his name was Hunley. And he said, oh, can I go out and try this submarine? I think we can break through the blockade if I can just use my submarine. They didn't have torpedoes back then. what they had was a long pole
The Obama.
with a bomb on the end of it, yeah, like a big thing of gunpowder there that could be detonated. So they would literally have to come over and ram a ship and hopefully blow a hole in it. Well, the Hunley at first said, the Confederate officer said, okay, yeah, you can go give her a shot. So off they went, they sailed out into the harbor, sank, and everybody died. So then they raised it up, I swear.
Oh,
They raised it up, and Beauregard was in command at Charleston Harbor at the time. And they said, General Beauregard, can we please go try this again? He said, no, I can't spare them. And he said, come on, one more time, if this thing works. So he said, okay, go give it a shot. So they sailed it on out, and it sank, and everybody died. So they raised it up again, and eventually Beauregard was transferred, and they managed to get the next commander of Charleston to allow them to try one more time. And they went out, and they did manage to jam it into the USS Housatonic. And they sank the USS Housatonic, and that was the first successful submarine attack in history. So that's another reason why the Civil War is a modern war. Think about it. We already talked about trains. I refuse to tell you what to write down. We already talked about trains, capital H-O-U-S-T-A-N-I-C, capital H-O-U-S, Hughes, A-T-O-N-I-C. Okay. We already talked about trains, an army arriving on a battlefield of trains. That was first Bull Run. Now we talked about a successful submarine attack. Talked about ironclad ships. Here are a few other things that came up during the Civil War. Repeating rifles. Up to this point, what you got with a musket or even with a rifle was one shot. Then you went through a tedious process of reloading it. I mentioned that during the American Revolution, if they could fire really, really quickly, like the British troops, that would be 3 times in a minute. That would be amazingly fast. Most people couldn't do that. 2 was kind of the standard. Well, now weapons are coming out. They're going to have 11 shots before you need to refire. That's a game changer, or reload. That's a game changer. They also had this charming young lady here, Florence Nightingale, who brought battlefield first aid into the world. Up until that time, what they did was they pretty much waited until after the battle and then took care of the wounded. Or what they had was maybe something very close by, hopefully stop the bleeding or something, but actually taking care of people on the battlefield and getting them anything near reasonable help. That's a new idea. There's the trains again, and also balloons. Balloons are a weird one. You have, originally what they wanted was they were using them as weather balloons. Put the balloon up so we can see, will it be a reasonable, things are going to be good for an attack tomorrow or whatever. But then they realized once they put the balloon up that, hey, even without taking the high ground, we have a command of the battlefield. We can see what's going on here. And another invention made it possible for them to communicate, and that was the telegraph. So if you put one end of a telegraph in the balloon and the other end down on the ground, they can communicate clearly with each other, not just shouting and hope you hear me during a battle. So those things all helped to make the Civil War the first modern war. And as we talked about, it was the last of the gentlemen's wars, where people would do things that they wouldn't probably do anymore. At the battle called the Wilderness, fire started. It was a very, very thick woods. And the battle just stopped for a while as people from both sides moved wounded soldiers away from the fire because they had fought bravely and they did not deserve to burn to death. That was too horrible as well. And I mentioned at Fredericksburg, come on. Okay, well, I guess I won't do that. All right. So cool. Let me see here. We're good here.